And you know that there are people who say you preach everything in the Bible pointing to Jesus, and there are other good men who just don't think that's right, and that you shouldn't preach Christ from Jacob wrestling with God, and you should preach about wrestling with God in prayer or suffering or something like that. Honestly, I believe that those good and sincere men are wrong on the basis of reading the Bible and understanding hermeneutics and so on, but part of this goes back to, I remember some years ago when I sat down with my wife. You know what it's like on the way home after the sermon. First you're hoping she'll say, "Great sermon, honey." And then she doesn't say anything, so you fear the worst. And I remember one day we really got into it, and I said, "Well, let me ask you a question. How often do you think it was a great sermon? I mean, how many weeks out of the month?" And she said, "No more than one in 4 or 5, is what she said. So we sat down, and at one point, here's what she said. I mean, in general, it's been a pretty long time, but she says, for a good part of your sermon, in fact, all your sermons are great. They're rational, they're biblical, they're exegetical, and they show me how I should live, and they show me what I should believe. But she says, every so often, suddenly at the end, Jesus shows up. And when Jesus shows up, suddenly it stops being a lecture and becomes a sermon to me." And she says, "Because when you say, this is what you ought to do, this is what you ought to do, this is what you ought to do," she says, I know, okay, now I'm a little clearer on it. I'm a little more guilty about it. Good, that's fine. But she says, sometimes you get to the place where you say, this is what you ought to do, but you really probably can't do it. Oh, but there's one who did. And because he did it on our behalf and in our place, if we believe in him, we'll begin to be able to do it too. You see, but only to the degree that we understand what he did for us. And she says, that's different. She says, so one time out of 4 or 5, your lecture becomes a sermon. When Jesus shows up, I want to do that. I have hope. And I begin to see how I can do it. And I didn't really understand, but basically, even I went to... But now I do. And here's the thing. Your preaching will never be doxological, and it won't even be central unless it's Christocentric. Here's why. If you tell people they need to be generous, and why aren't you being more generous? I happen to know you're not being generous. I mean, I've got, it's sometimes hard to tell whether people are, how lust in their hearts is doing from week to week, but you do know about their generosity from week to week. But why aren't people generous? Are they just being sinners? Let's go back to Martin Luther. Let's go back to the Catechism. If you're not being generous, then there's something else going on there, is there not? You're saying your status or your security, which is based on money, is very important to you. Or you need to be able to buy certain clothes and move in certain circles and go certain places. Human approval, security. There's idols underneath the lack of generosity. The money is more than just money. It's security, it's significance, it's status, it's more than you've got to do something to make that money just money, then they'll give it away. How do you do that? You have to show Jesus Christ is their true wealth. You have to show them what their idols are. You got to get to Jesus. And as a result, if you don't get there, you are going to find that you're just wailing on people's wills. You're beating on their wills. Sinclair Ferguson wrote a book that is almost impossible to find because it was put out as a little pamphlet by the Proc Trust in the UK. But the name of it is Preaching Christ from the Old Testament. And this is what he says. He says, what I just said a minute ago, that he says most preachers not only don't preach Christ from the Old Testament, but they don't preach it from the New Testament. And he says, quote, "The preacher has looked into the text, even in the New Testament, principally to find himself and his congregation, not to find Christ." He says, and you can even do that in the New Testament, even in the Gospels. He says, the sermon, therefore, is consequently about the people in the Gospels instead of about the Christ who is that gospel. The more fundamental issue is this question. What is the Bible really about? Is the Bible basically about me and what I must do? Or is it basically about Jesus and what he has done? Is the Bible basically about the objective and the indicative? And then here's a for example, that's why he says you do have to be careful. Hermeneutics is important. You can't you can't just find Jesus in every little twig. And there needs to be a way in which you are following the trajectory of the text, no matter what that text is, to Jesus. You have to show how Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of that particular the trajectory of the text. You've got to be responsible. And yet, it's as Sinclair says, it's more than an instinct. It's more like an instinct. It's not so much just right hermeneutical principles. It's an instinct. Do you believe the Bible is basically about you or basically about him? Is David and Goliath basically about you and how you can be like David and Goliath, or basically about him, the one who really took on the only giants that can really kill us? You see. And so his victory is imputed to us. Who's it really about? That's the fundamental question. And when that happens, then you start to read the Bible new. Jesus is the true and better Adam who passed the test in the garden, his garden, a much tougher garden, and whose obedience is imputed to us. Jesus is the true and better Abel, who, though innocently slain, has blood that cries out, not for our condemnation, but for our acquittal. Jesus is the true and better Abraham, who answered the call of God to leave all the comfortable and familiar and go into the void, not knowing whither he went. Jesus is the true and better Isaac, who was not just offered up by his father on the mount, but was truly sacrificed for us all, while God said to Abraham, "Now I know you love me, because you did not withhold your son, your only son, whom you love from me." Now we, at the foot of the cross, can say to God, "Now we know that you love me, because you did not withhold your son, your only son, whom you love from me." Jesus is the true and better Jacob, who wrestled and took the blow of justice we deserve, so we, like Jacob, only receive the wounds of grace that wake us up and discipline us. Jesus is the true and better Joseph, who is at the right hand of the king and forgives those who betrayed and sold him and uses his power to save them. Jesus is the true and better Moses, who stands in the gap between the people and the Lord and who mediates a new covenant. Jesus is the true and better rock of Moses, who, struck with the rod of God's justice, now gives us water in the desert. Jesus is the true and better Job. He's the truly innocent sufferer who then intercedes for and saves his stupid friends. Is that a type? See, that's not typology, that's an instinct. Jesus is the true and better David, whose victory becomes his people's victory, though they never lifted a stone to accomplish it themselves. Jesus is the true and better Esther, who didn't just risk losing an earthly palace, but lost the ultimate heavenly one, who didn't just risk his life, but gave his life, who didn't just say, "If I perish, I perish," says, "When I perish, I'll perish for them, to save my people." Jesus is the true and better Jonah, who was cast out into the storm so we could be brought in. He's the real Passover lamb. He's the true temple, the true prophet, the true priest, the true king, the true sacrifice, the true lamb, the true light, the true bread. The Bible's not about you. And that's an instinct. And until that shows up in your sermons, it'll be lectures, not sermons. It won't be doxology, it won't be central.